I want to talk about a very important subject when it comes to understanding the original revelation in the Old Testament, the 5 books of Moses. The 5 books of Moses are the basis for all of the laws in Judaism as we know it. When studying Judaism, you'll come across various interpretations and various sects of Judaism. So I want to make some things clear. Any book that follows the 5 books of Moses, that in any which way contradicts the original revelation from God, is by definition an illegitimate book on the Torah. Because what it says in the 5 books of Moses very clearly is that you shall not add or subtract to the words written in the 5 books of Moses. It also says that these are God's commandments revealed to Moses during the 40 years that the Jewish people were in the desert, and that is the basis for the religion known as Judaism. When you discuss this with a Reform rabbi, for example, a Reform rabbi will tell you, well, you know, as time has gone along, we've been able to reform the original text, and we've been able to add and subtract as we please because we want to, and we feel like it, and we feel that at this point in time, we're more enlightened than Moses was. We're more enlightened than an individual who spoke face to face with God himself, and whom God said is trustworthy, and that the commandments that were transmitted through Moses are eternal commandments. So clearly, all forms of the secularization and the modernization of Judaism, to the exclusion of the explicit texts in the Bible, are illegitimate. Where things get very strange is when you come to Orthodox Judaism, because Orthodox Judaism believes in the original revelation that God gave to Moses. In fact, they'll tell you it is divine and it is true. But there is something called the oral Torah, oral referring to the mouth. And so, even though that there is 5 books where the revealed word of God is written, there is also an oral tradition that dates back to Mount Sinai as well. So just as far back as the revelation to Moses goes the revelation of the oral Torah, the Torah that was transmitted just from mouth to mouth, from one generation to the next, and consists of people's interpretations and traditions of practices relating to the Torah. There's only one problem with this claim. The oral Torah is not so oral. It's actually written down. It's written down in numerous books, known as the Midrash, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Halacha. All of these books were written at least 1,500 years after the revelation at Sinai. They consist of opinions of rabbis. Anyone who has ever opened one of these books will read very clearly, Rabbi so-and-so said this, and Rabbi so-and-so said that. And they're essentially discussions and debates and arguments and opinions about the original text in the Bible. Now, to claim that a discussion about the Bible over 1,000 years after the revelation of the 5 books of Moses is somehow also dating back to Mount Sinai is obviously an absurd claim. Yet they will repeat this to you as if it is truth, and it is part of indoctrination to believe whether or not it makes sense. Now, what happens when you begin to buy this narrative that outside of the original revelation from God, there is an additional 1,000, probably, altogether, books that also somehow date back to Sinai, and that this tradition is so well kept that it's equally as valid, if not even more valid, than the original Torah itself? Well, when you follow this narrative, the observance of Judaism begins to take on a whole new form. It begins to take on a form that actually is not even reminiscent of the original text and the original commandments from God himself. For example, on Shabbat, the 7th day, a day of rest, a day where God says, You must cease all of your activities, not do any work of any kind. Make it a holy day for God. Don't leave your place. Have all your food cooked on the 6th day before the 7th day. And rest. That is the Sabbath in the Bible. Well, according to rabbinic literature, one is also obligated on the Sabbath to eat 3 meals. One is also obligated to pray 3 times a day. Not only on the Sabbath, as it turns out, but you have to pray 3 times a day, every day, with a group of 10 men who read a prayer book and repeat essentially the same prayers 3 times a day, every single day, claiming that this is the highest form of prayer and the highest form of communion with God. We can go on and on about all of the many times that the rabbinic commandments blatantly contradict the Bible or have absolutely no source in the Bible, in which case they are just commandments that were invented by human beings and added to the original text to now say that it's all a commandment from God. And this is an extremely concerning phenomenon for anyone that actually cares about the preservation of the Torah and the preservation of Judaism, because the majority of Jews are not affiliated with Judaism. The majority of Jews do not even care about the Torah. And so for the minority of Jews to be invested in a form of Judaism that is not accurate and is not in line with the original text in the Torah, this is extremely harmful and causes Judaism to essentially be eliminated. Because if 80% of Jews are not following the Torah at all, and if the other 20% are following the Torah incorrectly because they're just following their own narrative, well then what we're looking at is an entire Jewish people, an entire nation that was chosen and charged with a mission from God to uphold His laws in this world and to be completely committed to their role as priests amongst the nations, to teach God's law and to live in accordance with His laws. You now have a people that are completely disconnected from God. And that's a tragedy. That's actually the worst case scenario. And the truth is, it's nothing new. It's nothing new that the Jewish people are disconnected from God, despite being brought close by God, despite being saved from slavery by God, despite having a covenant with God that dates back to the days of their ancestors. Unfortunately, the nation of Israel has failed miserably, for the most part, in upholding God's laws. If one reads the books of Judges and the books of Kings and the prophets, you will see that the history, even during the times when the kingdom existed in the land of Israel, was a very dire time for the Jewish people. They were involved with idol worship. Idolatry was happening all over the place. Prostitution, all sorts of sinful activities. In fact, the land was contaminated with all of the sin of the Jewish people in the land that God had given them and promised that they would keep it only if they observed His decrees and His commandments. There was even a time during the reign of King Josiah. Josiah was a descendant of King David, who, as he was the king, discovered the Bible, discovered the Old Testament in the archives of the temple. And upon reading it, he began to cry, and he said, "This is the foundation of our religion, and we're in complete denial of it. We don't even know that it exists." And so you can see what an absurdity it is to claim that the oral Torah has been preserved over thousands of years, when in fact the written Torah, the original document, the direct word of God, was completely lost for a time. So the problem here is that people are so distant from the ways of God, and they're so unfamiliar with the original commandments of God, that there's almost no chance that they'd be able to obey His decrees correctly. Those who are lost in the rabbit holes of orthodoxy find themselves debating all sorts of irrelevant information that has nothing to do with God's laws. Those who are on the outskirts of orthodoxy look at orthodoxy as a representation of Judaism, and they laugh at it, rightfully so, and they say, we don't want to have anything to do with that. They deny their obligations to God, along with all of their brothers and sisters of the Jewish people. And this is really problematic, because the most important thing for human beings is that they have a good relationship with God. The most important thing for our world is that we're living in accordance with the divine principles that God set in place in order for this creation to be governed correctly. And the more that corruption goes on, the more that we go down the pathways of evil, as opposed to moving in the direction of good, the further we are away from salvation. And when God goes ahead and chooses a nation and says, you're going to be my servants, you're going to have to be there to uphold my decrees and to be a light unto the world and to teach the truth for all to hear. Yet instead, what we find is a nation in denial of their purpose, a nation who won't even acknowledge their own history and their own obligations to God himself. At that point, we're dealing with real issues that need to be resolved, and they need to be resolved swiftly. The good thing is that the solution already exists, and it's just the action that's required at this moment, the action on the part of the Jewish people to actually begin to care about their history and to begin to care about the revelation and the covenant that exists between them and God, and to wake up to their responsibility to God and to no one else, not to allow themselves to be brainwashed by all sorts of different interpretations and all the different overcomplications of what is a clear text with clear commandments and duties that are given to us that can uplift our lives in ways that we couldn't even imagine.